I would start by welcoming everybody this evening. And to start proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. I'd also like to acknowledge our special guest, Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, ACQC, the Governor of New South Wales, and her husband, Mr. Dennis Wilson. It's wonderful to have them and their support with us this evening. This evening's occasion is really a double header. It's the occasion of the annual Anne Woolcock Memorial Lecture, but it also marks the Institute's 40th anniversary. I shall talk briefly about the 40 years of existence, and then Professor Carolyn Moore will talk a little further about Anne Woolcock, her legacy, and the context of her work before introducing our guest speaker. Firstly, let me emphasize how wonderful it is to welcome so many people here today, albeit online. Representatives of the University of Sydney, which we have been affiliated with for all our 40 years, and representatives from the University of New South Wales, UTS, and Macquarie University, whom we worked with increasingly and harmoniously in recent years. There are also representatives from the local area health districts and other medical research institutes. We have with us this evening some of our past directors, board chairs, distinguished alumni, and very importantly, our current staff and affiliates. The wide range of attendees tonight is a measure of the Institute's standing and what it has achieved in all its 40 years. Turning to that history, I'm struck by Professor Ivan Young's words. As an ex-colleague of Anne Woolcock's and a director of the Institute, he has seen us through our 40 years. And he said more recently that no one 40 years ago could have ever conceived the Institute becoming the force for good that it has. As much as we praise the vision and drive of Anne Woolcock, we should also recognize all the others that have worked here and raised the Institute to its current standing in the world. We are now recognized globally as the leading respiratory and sleep medical research institute. Now, it would be invidious to mention names, but if ever any of our audience online tonight has an opportunity to visit the Woolcock, they will be struck by the past achievers who are honored in photos throughout the building. These people have contributed to the over 6,000 publications over the 40 years. They've all made breakthrough developments in many areas and made the Institute so well known throughout the world. We all owe all those people our thanks, but I also need to mention those institutions and people that have supported us over the years. The University of Sydney and now other universities, the Sydney Local Area Health District and other health districts, the state and federal governments, and many other organizations and people who have awarded us grants, made donations, and all those who have supported us. I, the board, and all at the Woolcock thank all our supporters. Without them, the Institute would not have achieved nearly as much as it has. Indeed, it may not have survived. The Institute is now looking forward to its next 40 years. There's much to do, and we will set to it with a will. Hard work is ahead of us, but with support and help of all those involved and interested in the Institute, I'm sure our best years lie ahead. Now, much as I like my voice, this is not my occasion, so I'll step aside, or move aside anyway, and hand over to Professor Moore to speak a little further about Anne Woolcock and her achievements and introduce the speaker. Professor Moore.
Thank you, Robert. So the purpose of the Anne Woolcock Lecture and the events associated with it is to accommodate the visit of eminent respiratory clinicians and scientists. The visit should promote the exchange of ideas, skills, and techniques between the Woolcock and national or international researchers. The Anne Woolcock Lecture is an annual event, and the program is a core activity of our institute. This year, in case you haven't noticed, the event is being held virtually. Professor Anne Woolcock was an original thinker who left the world of respiratory research an outstanding legacy. This legacy is in the form of a structured network of talented and enthusiastic respiratory and sleep researchers determined to investigate respiratory and sleep disorders, the underlying mechanisms, the role of allergy and inflammation, the physiology, the epidemiology, as well as the clinical and public health implications. Many outstanding researchers have devoted their lives to the investigation of new concepts to advance our knowledge of disease and its treatment. However, few have had the impact that Anne had on world knowledge and patient care. Anne leaves behind researchers whose career she's encouraged. She was not afraid to challenge the establishment and was incredibly loyal to her staff, her students, and her patients. She created an environment in which it was safe for early career researchers to think outside the box and even test these thoughts. She has furthered the careers of so many of today's stars in respiratory research. She really has left the world a better place than she found it. Thank you, Anne. So tonight, we welcome Professor Grant Waterer. Now, Professor Waterer is the Professor of Medicine at the University of Western Australia, the Adjunct Professor of Medicine at Northwestern University, Chicago, and Curtin University. And he's the Adjunct Professor at Edith Cowan University. He is the Area Director of Medical Services for East Metropolitan Health Service and the Director of Medical Services for Royal Perth Hospital Group. His main research interests are in pulmonary infections, especially pneumonia and non-tuberculous mycobacterial disease, as well as bronchiectasis and COPD. He has over 200 peer-reviewed publications and more than 70 invited international presentations. So tonight, Grant will focus on how infection has shaped us and our history, both through endemic infections, but especially through the great pandemics. Not only has infection played a major role in what we are and where we are, but our need to protect ourselves from infection continues to drive a lot of other diseases we have today. And before Grant starts his presentation, I'd just like to remind people that we will have time for Q&A at the end. But what you need to do is go to the Q&A at the bottom of the screen and type your question in, because we can't hear you all, and I will moderate the questions at the end and present them to Grant. So thank you, Grant, for being here tonight.
So thank you. Your Excellency, Woolcock board members, distinguished guests, thank you for the enormous honour and privilege of being asked to give this lecture. As a respiratory physician who specialises in infection, this has been a particularly interesting couple of years. But equally, people are getting a bit bored of talking about respiratory infection. And so when challenged with how to please give a lecture to a general public audience, how can I give you something that's not going to put you to sleep or make you turn over to better homes and gardens? So what I have done is indulge myself slightly in my historical interest in the great pandemics and infections, how infections have shaped us, and to try and put COVID perhaps in a slightly different context. I don't have any conflicts of interest with this presentation. I do want to acknowledge Professor Woolcock. I only heard her speak a couple of times. My research career really started in the late 90s. But she really showed people like me that it was possible for Australians to be leaders on the world stage. She was an absolute towering figure in academic respiratory medicine in Australia. Equally, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. In my case, that's the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and give my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Just to set the scene, if we look at worldwide causes of death, influenza and pneumonia, according to the World Health Organization, is the number 4 cause of death worldwide. And for the Woolcock Institute, if you add lung disease with influenza and pneumonia, you're talking about the second most common cause of death. And in the developing world, influenza and pneumonia is the number 2 cause of death today. The other really interesting thing, which most people aren't aware of, is how hereditary the risk of dying from infection is. And this is one of the classic studies published some time ago now, but they looked at nearly 1,000 adoptees born in the late 20s in Denmark. And they looked at what did the parents, the biological parents die of, and what did the adopted parents die of, to try and get some estimate of the difference between the risk of diseases due to environment and the risk of diseases due to genetics. If we look at adoptive parents, which is some measure of environmental risk, you can see that cancer overwhelmingly, if an adopted parent died of cancer, this massive increased risk of cancer in the adoptees, lower for cancer, for vascular, and really no evidence of a risk with infection. However, if you look at biologic parents, what did they die from? It's completely around the other way. So while there is a small risk of genetic risk associated with cancer, which we know of, there really is a massive increased risk of dying of infection if one of your biological parents has died of infection. And this tells us that genetically, the genetic influence on how you will respond to infection is really highly significant. So in this talk, I'm just going to look at some of the great plagues and how they shaped history, the impact of endemic infections on humans, and try and close off with some of my research-related stuff in terms of why is infection still a major issue today, not even counting COVID. So this is a plague mask. You can see it in the in the museum in Berlin. All the plague masks, which I'll talk about in the Great Death, had these long noses because they used to pack them with sweet-smelling flowers and scents because they believed that smell was how plague transmitted. And this is one of the medieval manuscripts just documenting the impact of plague. So the first truly big plague was the Antonine Plague. This was named after one of the Antonine emperors, Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was the supposed emperor at the start of the film Gladiator. It's also known as the Plague of Galen because the physician whose accounts survive describing all of this still exists in his tome Methodus Medendi. And it arrived in the Roman Empire in 165 in the Common Era and raged through the Roman world for about 15 years, flared up briefly, and then became an endemic low-level problem ever from that date. This is the extent of the Roman Empire in around 125 AD, the huge Mediterranean basin, obviously all the way up to Scotland, along the rivers Rhine and Danube, and well into Central Asia here. In particular, this area is where we're interested in, because at the time there were two emperors, an Emperor Lucius Verus, who was on campaign in Persia, in the city of Seleucia, which is now in modern-day Iraq, an epidemic that apparently had probably broken out sometime in 155 of the Common Era, had migrated into the area, and his legions got this epidemic. And because of the loss of men, they retreated back into the Roman Empire and brought the epidemic with them. And this epidemic was almost certainly smallpox, and the first massive arrival of smallpox into the Mediterranean basin. And it was associated with fever, diarrhea, pharyngitis, but most typically this skin eruption, dry, sometimes pustular, occurring on the 9th day. And if we look at pottery and sculptures from the time, you can see here that the classic lesions, the facial lesions here, and obviously very similar to this is smallpox from an unfortunate soul in the Ethiopia in the 70s. It's estimated that 7 to 10% of the population died in the Roman Empire, which is between 5 and 10 million deaths. But in the big urban centres, it was much higher. 30% is the estimates for the death rate in Rome. there was a particularly high rate of mortality in the legions. And because of that, they had to replace the soldiers with whoever they could get. And from that time, there was a massive drop in the skill and professionalism of the legions. And they also had to increasingly recruit barbarians from over the border into the legions, which had some flow-on effects. And there was a particularly high mortality rate in young children. And there continued to be minor outbreaks every few years, particularly in young children. And this had a significant effect on population growth. In fact, population stymied. To just divert slightly, this is one of history's great villains. There's a statue of him in London, Field Marshal Geoffrey Lord Amherst. He was in charge of British troops in the 760s in the Ohio and Delaware Basin. And he ordered smallpox-infected blankets to be brought from Boston to spread to the Indians to give them smallpox to, quote, extirpate this execrable race. As a result of that, 50 to 60% of the American Indian population disappeared from smallpox. And in some areas, it was as high as 90%. And that's one of the better documented episodes of bioterrorism, really, in our history. Pizarro is reported to have done the same thing in America, but it's not as well documented as Sir Geoffrey Amherst, who actually, the letters of him ordering the blankets to do this are still in existence. We know that smallpox lesions have been identified on Egyptian corpses from 1100 before the Common Era. There are written depictions of smallpox-like disease in China and India for well over 1,000 years prior to the Common Era. And it's always devastating on first contact. There is recent evidence that suggests that modern smallpox, as in smallpox that was circulating in the 1920s and 30s, is genetically different from the ancient smallpox that was circulating at around the time of the Antonine Plague. And that's looking at genetic differences between some burial samples of Viking smallpox from around 700. Smallpox is very lethal to children, but confers lifetime immunity. But whenever it's introduced, there's this massive mortality. So, for example, Japan lost a third of its population in the 700s. It did seem to go away for many hundreds of years, but came back. And in the 1800s, around 400,000 deaths a year in Europe. But for well over 150 years, 1 in 8 children would be expected to have died from smallpox. And you need to consider that in terms of what effect that may have had on selecting various genetic predispositions to how one might respond to a viral infection. This is an icon of St. Cyprian. And the Plague of Ciprian was named after him. He was Bishop of Carthage, which is in modern Tunisia. And it broke out around Easter of 250. At its height, there were 5,000 deaths a day in Rome. And it was associated with bloody diarrhea, vomiting, fever, conjunctival hemorrhage, leg paralysis, deafness, and blindness. Although some authors have suggested that maybe it was smallpox or measles again, it's actually very clear when you read the descriptions that this was a hemorrhagic fever. Probably not Ebola, because the mortality rate was only around 20 to 25%, but a Marburg-like or one of the other viral hemorrhagic fevers. And so if we want to know what would it look like if Ebola ever broke out, this plague of St. Cyprian is very much what it would look like. The total mortality is unclear, but given that, and it was a time of political unrest, we don't have as many written sources as earlier for the plague of the Antonine Plague. But the estimates are between 10 and 20% of the total population in the Roman Empire. But in the bigger cities like Rome or Alexandria, 2/3 of the population had died or fled by 262. There was complete collapse of agriculture and the economic base. Further drop-off in the legions made it impossible for them to fend off serial invasions. And the further erosion of the professionalism and experience in the legions, as well as the tax base to pay for them, created major problems for the Roman state. And it's also interesting in the role it played in the adoption of Christianity, because from the time of this plague, there was a massive uptake in the Christian religion, which has been attributed to the fact that the traditional Roman gods failed the population. And because Christianity promised an afterlife rather than a cure, and possibly because some of the early Christian churches did play a role in caring for a lot of the victims of this plague, Christianity became very popular from that time. And just keep that in mind when we get to the plague of Justinian in a bit. If you add these two plagues together, there was a massive reduction in population, a massive reduction in economic base, a huge reduction in the professionalism number of troops. They had to import more barbarians into the legions, which meant that those then gained experience, and when they went back, further upskilled the barbarian tribes. And so in the end of the day, although disease wasn't the only cause, effectively the Western Roman Empire was outbred. The barbarians closed the technology gap, and the Romans lacked the tax base to support enough army to keep the barbarians out when the Hunnic invasions that started in the mid-350s started to push all the Goths westward into Roman territory. You can actually see evidence of this in a number of ways, and this is measures of lead levels, which is a measure of how much iron is being smelted in cores in Greenland. And if you look at the classic Roman period, from around the time of the Antonine Plague and through the Plague of Ciprian, you can see here this dramatic drop-off in industrial activity, which really was not even recovered still by 700. And if you look at various other measures of wealth and economy, so people look at marine shipwrecks as a measure of private trade income, archaeological artifacts as private consumption, the size of the Roman army state, which is well known, the cash flow in terms of coinage, the amount of silver in the coins, which obviously they debased as they started to get into problems. You can see here the plague of the Antonine Plague, the Plague of Ciprian. Very much the Western Roman Empire was very much on the decline and never recovered from that period. So this is a tile mosaic of the Emperor Justinian, who was one of the greatest, what we call the Byzantine, but they just called the Roman Empire. And his wife Theodora is one of the most colourful and most powerful women rulers that has ever been documented. Around 541 in the Common Era, and then intermittently for really 200 years, there was the first plague pandemic due to Yersinia pestis. And that's now been well documented from samples from graves. It started in Egypt. It was first documented near Suez. And Constantinople, which is where Emperor Justinian and the Byzantine Empire was based, relied on Egypt for its grain much as Rome did. So anything that got to Egypt very quickly moved into the rest of the Eastern Roman Empire. Interestingly, genetic analysis of the plague strains suggests that it probably didn't start in Egypt. It was probably brought to Egypt from Central Asia around Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. But it clearly spread across the Mediterranean basin and the Middle East, and it had a massive impact on both the Eastern Roman and Persian empires. At its peak, it was reported that of 10,000 deaths per day. We don't know the true figure, but we do know there was massive depopulation across the Eastern Mediterranean basin and Asia Minor. This is the red line here is the extent of the Roman Empire under Justinian. And you can see how that relatively quickly it shrank. And a major factor in this was the population and therefore economic loss driven by the first plague pandemic. At the time of the Justinian plague, the great General Belisarius, who was Justinian's most amazing general, and he was at the point of recapturing Italy and the Western Empire for Justinian. And history may well have been very, very different had plague not broken out and stopped his reconquest of those areas. Now, what is interesting, and this will come up a couple of times, is that immediately prior to this outbreak of plague, there was major environmental upheaval. 536 was described as the year without sun, or the year without summer, much like in 1816, but in terms of its effects, worse. We're not quite clear which volcanoes blew up to cause this, but as you can see from the accounts, during this year, a most dread portent took place, where the sun gave forth its light without brightness, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear. This volcanic activity led to what was called the Late Antiquity Little Ice Age, and there was massive failure of crops across Asia, in Europe. Its effects were felt all the way as far as Ireland, Eastern China, and Mesoamerica. And it's felt that this change in climate led to a change in particularly the rodents that carry plague that moved west, along with obviously the nomads that were following, to where they could find pastures for their animals. And so this movement of animals with their vectors led plague arriving on the European doorstep. It's estimated that between 15 and 100 million people died. That's between 30 to 60% of the known population in the Eastern Mediterranean in the first 3 to 4 years. Recent estimates are closer to 50% in the initial phase, and a further 10% reduction every 15 years until the mid-600s. So if you can do the maths on that, the first plague pandemic had a massive impact on what was a thriving, economic, viable population. As I already said, the Eastern Roman Empire wasn't able to continue its reconquest. The impact in Western Europe is not as well documented, because that was, after all, the Dark Ages, and we have few documents from that period. But we do know from grave evidence that there was spread of plague as far as Scandinavia and Yemen. But the massively depopulated Asia Minor and the vast reduction in the armies of the Eastern Roman and Persian empires meant that the relatively small armies of the First Caliphate was really set up for success that would not have been possible had it not been for the depopulation due to plague. This is the remains of a hill fort, or a fort in what was Kaffa on the Black Sea in the Ukraine. And in 1346, as the story goes, there was a fight broke out in a market between the Muslims and the Christians, and the Muslims called in the local Tatar, which is the local Mongol ruler, to solve the dispute. The Christians barricaded themselves in their quarter, and so a siege began. When when plague broke out in the Tatar army, they started to catapult the bodies of the plague victims into the Christian sector. Now, that wouldn't have caused plague to spread out, almost certainly, because it's coming from the rats, that they would have been there anyway. But psychologically, it drove the Christians to flee, who took plague back through to Europe. It isn't the only time that people have done that. Napoleon, famously at Elba, also catapulted the bodies of plague victims over the walls to try and spread panic and get them to evacuate. Now, that's a nice story. It may not actually be true, but that is the traditional story of how plague first came. But it certainly came with grain shipments. What is important is that if you look at how plague spread here, the very key feature was the fact that at the time, the Mongol Empire was in its peak and had spread really from Asia all the way into Europe. And you could, via means of effectively a version of the Pony Express, travel very quickly across large amounts of land. But not only that, it was routine to do so. The Mongol Empire had facilitated trade across many areas of Asia and Europe, which meant that diseases were flowing with them to populations that hadn't seen them before. If you look at how this epidemic of plague spread, the earliest reports we have in Kaffa, then where you would expect it from grain shipments, Constantinople, through the grain routes, through Sicily, south of France, and then so on. Interestingly, Eastern Europe was relatively spared in this plague pandemic. That had one of the ramifications of that, during this plague epidemic, there started to be mass crimes against Jews. Large numbers of people held the Jews responsible for the plague. There were pogroms where tens of thousands of Jewish people were killed. And as a result, most of the Jewish population of Western Europe moved into Eastern Europe at that time, which of course then became relevant as to why there were so many Jews there at the time of World War II. Prior to 1347, there was massive population growth in Europe. Virtually all the arable land in Europe was used up. The beginning of the damming of the sea to create places like the Netherlands, and all the forests in Western Central Europe were gone. Any forest you find now certainly west of the Rhine, will date from the Black Death. Between the period of 1300 to 1500, it got wetter and colder. There were massive crop failures between 1315 to 1317. And so prior to plague arriving, you had overcrowding and a massively undernourished population. Equally, at the same time, there was a much drier climate in Eastern and Central Asia that pushed marmosets and the other grain animals that are plague hosts westwards into non-immune areas. And because the Mongol Empire had vast trading routes from China to the Black Sea through that area, it acted as a conduit for the plague. There is historical evidence that although we talk about 1347 for Europe, it's pretty clear that Western China was suffering from plague in the late 1200s, and there was clearly plague around at the siege of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258. So the plague had been moving west for some time before it finally reached Europe. And just again to re-emphasize the size of the Mongol Empire, but again, if we try and keep relating things back to COVID, a degree of climate change coupled with an ability to rapidly transit disease from immune to non-immune populations or transit new diseases is a key factor in the Black Death. Plague itself, there are three different forms. The most common is bubonic, where you get black nodules, which are basically abscesses in your lymph nodes in the neck, armpit, and groin. It's got a 20 to 40% mortality over 1 to 2 weeks. Pneumonic plague tends to break out in colder weather, spread from person to person. And it's got a mortality rate of 90 to 95% in a couple of days. And all the highest rates of plague deaths occur with pneumonic plague, and particularly in the winter months. Septicemic plague is much rarer. It occurs in warmer weather, but has an overwhelming 100% mortality and relatively quick death.
Okay.
This is a picture just of buboes. This is what they look like in the groin and the leg. This is from the Great Fire of London. And again, this is a plague. This is PPE from the personal protective equipment from the 1300s. This is a typical plague doctor outfit. What was the impact of the Black Death? I think this is just worth reading out from Giovanni Boccaccio. Tedious were it to recount how citizen avoided citizen, how among neighbours was scarce found any that showed fellow feeling for another, how king's folk held aloof and never met, or but rarely. Enough that this sore affliction entered so deep into the minds of men and women that in the horror thereof, brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, brother by sister, and oftentimes husband by wife. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to believe, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited to their fate, as if they had been strangers. The profound psychological impact of the Black Death can't be underestimated. Over a third of Europe and Asia's population died in the first wave. In some regions, that was up to 70%. And successive waves over 70 years reduced the population by 50 to 70%. If you look at the population of England, it reached a pre-plague height of around 5 million. You can see the immediate impact of the first wave and subsequent waves. And 300 years later, the population still hasn't recovered. This is Barcelona. And again, you can see impact of initial plague, but then this is plague deaths year by year over 300 years. You can see how these intermittent waves of plague completely flattened the population for hundreds of years. And obviously that had profound impacts. Some of those impacts, prior to the plague, medieval serfdom was the model, but due to the massive deaths in serfdom and the labour shortages, a process that had just started prior to the onset of plague developed very quickly, where it suddenly became a seller's market, as it were, for labour. And average wages rose substantially. The middle class developed. There was a profound change in attitudes towards life and death. And that absolutely was part of the drive of things like the Protestant Reformation and the dramatic decline in papal authority from that point. It was also marked by the establishment of the great medical schools of Europe and the science of public health. So really, public health got started, particularly in Bologna and then later Paris, all in response to dealing with plague and attitudes to the need for proper sanitation, fresh water, and the science around that really started at that time. And there's also no question that the change in art that we see from pre and post plague, that these changes in attitude really were significant drivers towards the Renaissance. And fundamentally, due to, again, changes in labour, there were massive changes in agriculture and industry, and the traditional model of having guilds to control industry really fell apart at that point. This is just a plague 1720 in Marseille. And there was a third pandemic that most of us don't really appreciate, but that began in Yunnan in China in 1855. And there is evidence that was the emergence of a new, more virulent strain than had previously been around, with waning community immunity. It went worldwide, mostly to ports. There were certainly cases in Perth and Fremantle. Around 12 to 15 million deaths, mostly in China and India. It was mostly bubonic plague, except in northern China and Mongolia. In Australia, 1,300 cases, 535 deaths officially reported. And if we look at Europe, you can see how very much in that pre-war, that interwar period was really the peak of plague in Europe. This is in Queensland. This is the ratters, people employed to get rid of the rats out of warehouses and wharves in response to the plague epidemics that broke out. What many people don't appreciate is that plague still rages today. Madagascar is, in fact, accounts for around 70% of plague cases worldwide. In 2015, 263 cases, 71 fatal. In 2017, they had a major outbreak of pneumonic plague. They, in fact, ran out of coffins. And that was a major problem for them, given the limited resources in Madagascar. There are other cases of plague intermittently, particularly in the southwest of the US and Central America. But Madagascar is definitely the current major focus of plague. So there's a disease that most people won't even have heard of. And if we think that Black Plague, if we think that the Great Death was bad, that Ebola breaking out and the Plague of Ciprian was bad, Kokoliski, and I have no clue how to pronounce it, is absolute evidence that we got lucky with COVID, even though it doesn't feel like that. This is from the local word in Central America for pest or pestilence. And between 1545 and 1576, it wiped out as much as 17 million people in Central America, which is 80% of the population. And we have some really good autopsy studies from one of the court physicians at the time. He describes people as having high fever, severe headache, vertigo, blood dysentery, severe abdominal pain and chest pain, large nodules behind the ears invading the neck and face, profuse bleeding from the nose, ears, eyes and mouth, black tongue, dark urine, yellow eyes and skin, gangrene of the hands, feet and lips, and death within 3 to 4 days, and 100% death rate if your nose bleeding did not rapidly slow in the first couple of days. And at autopsy, massive lung and liver hemorrhage, as well as a petechial rash. This is almost certainly, again, an Ebola-like illness, a viral hemorrhagic fever, which, as I'll show you, there are a number from a local rodent host. There have been some autopsy studies that have found some paratyphus C. Paratyphus C doesn't really fit with all of this, but as I'll show you now, it may be responsible for one of the later epidemics. So this is the population of essentially Central America at around the time of Pizarro. Smallpox caused a reduction, but you can see here this first episode of this viral hemorrhagic fever, the massive reduction in population that caused. It's possible that one of these later little epidemics was paratyphy, but most likely, again, they were still viral hemorrhagic fever. And there are a number of viral hemorrhagic fevers that have been identified as coming from this region, all of which are putative potential causes, particularly the ones in the north of South America. Again, what's interesting here is that prior to the outbreak, there was a mega drought, the largest drought that has been documented in this region. You can see here, this is average rainfall. And prior to these plagues breaking out and during them, there was a massive reduction in rainfall. And so again, the thought is that this caused a change in behavior of the local rodents and probably the local population, pushed them closer together. And then the endemic viral fevers that are in the rodents transited into the humans, and away we went. In terms of modern plagues, this is the influenza outbreak of 1918. This is one of the classic photos of a field hospital in the US. And this plague very much is what has driven pretty much all public health planning for pandemics ever since. So it's called the Spanish flu, but it actually probably started in the USA in Kansas and was taken to Europe by US troops. It peaked between February 1918 and April 1920. It suggested that up to 500 million people were infected and up to 50 million deaths. Deaths were absolutely more common in younger adults, and that was unusual because usually influenza will kill the youngest and the most elderly. However, younger adults appeared to be particularly susceptible to this strain. There are also good autopsy series that show that there were very high rates of staphylococcal pneumonia as a secondary infection. And there may well have been a similar cytokine storm and an immune response problem as we've seen in COVID-19, particularly during the early years. There have been a number of influenza outbreaks since, but most overwhelmingly, it's the 1918 to 19 that had the biggest influence. Of course, HIV is a viral plague that is now endemic across the world. In 2016, WHO estimated more than 36 million people having died, and it's still a vast problem in the developing world, particularly in Africa today. Now, the great killers over time have been tuberculosis and malaria. This is tuberculosis. And today, even still worldwide, it's generally in the developing world, tuberculosis is usually the 5th or 6th most common cause of death. And if you put it together with HIV, it may well be the 2nd or 3rd most common cause of death. And you can see that it's endemic in all the developing world. And increasingly so, there are concerns about Russia and Eastern Europe. And some of you will know that as well, there are strains of tuberculosis that are becoming increasingly resistant to antibiotics, so-called pan-resistant or XDR-resistant tuberculosis, which, if healthcare workers get them, have 90 to 100% mortality. And so tuberculosis remains an ever-present infection threat that has also modified us over time. If we just look again at the cause of death in low-income countries, lower respiratory tract infections, number 2 cause of death. Tuberculosis on its own, which of course is also a lower respiratory infection, 8th most common cause of death. So worldwide, in terms of impact, respiratory infections having a massive impact. What obvious, apart from the genetic susceptibility stuff I showed you at the beginning, what obvious impacts have there been of infection on our genetics? Well, if we look at malaria deaths, again, poor Africa are suffering in particular, but malaria across the world, particularly in the tropical regions, as a major problem. If we then look at the diseases alpha and beta thalassemia, they have a significant correlation with areas with malaria, and that's because having a few, so these diseases are caused by multiple mutations in some of the genes to do with hemoglobin in your red blood cells. Having a couple of mutations gives you relative resistance to malaria. Having a lot gives you thalassemia. And so these diseases, the thalassemia, which can cause anemia and need you to have recurrent blood transfusions, have very much been preserved in the human genome and promoted in the human genome because of a relative advantage over malaria. Equally, sickle cell disease, which is highly prevalent in the US because of the African American population. Sickle cell disease also, if it requires 2 genes to be abnormal for you to get it, if you have 1, you're resistant to malaria. So these are very obvious examples of how genetically, to deal with a threat of endemic infection, we have developed genetic changes that have led to some adverse results. Now, pretty much for any significant cause of infection, men are about 20% more likely to die than women. It varies from infection to infection, but generally women are more protected against infection than men. And that is almost certainly because prior to antibiotics, 1 in 10 women died of infection associated with childbirth. And you can see how with the introduction of antibiotics here, how the puerperal sepsis, so sepsis around the time of childbirth, basically disappears as a cause of death from the time of antibiotics. There are obviously still some, but antibiotics, dramatic impact on how women were dying. And so women very much have been selected genetically for being able to resist infection. And as I'll get to in a little bit, that becomes interesting in terms of why may it be that autoimmune diseases are more common in women than men. So there is a downside of good immunity. We know this, and this relates in part to the hygiene hypothesis, which is one of the theories of why asthma is going up, that if you look from the 1950s, the rate in the prevalence in the population of all kinds of autoimmune diseases, Crohn's, multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, asthma, has all significantly increased. And one of the theories here is that we are genetically programmed to have a very avid immune response to infection to keep us safe and allow us to breed and, pass on our genes. But when infection stops being as significant a problem, your immune system then finds other ways to respond to things, and not necessarily in a positive manner. My interest in particular is in how infections, lung infections, pneumonia, influenza, drives other diseases. So we've known for some time that following an acute infection, acute respiratory infection, you have a very significant risk of increased heart attack. So if you take someone and you compare them to someone who's identical in terms of age and risk factors, sex, the white person who has a respiratory tract infection for the next few days has a 5 times increased risk of having a myocardial infarction. And that even extends out to up to 90 days in this study. There has been a lot of data that shows that influenza, every time you get an influenza peak, you get a peak in myocardial infarctions. In fact, it's very typical worldwide that if you plot the number of people who present to an emergency department with an influenza-like illness, in 7 to 10 days post that, you will also see the peak each year of the number of people presenting with myocardial infarction or stroke. There's a very strong association between influenza and people developing myocardial infarction or stroke. And there's a lot of very good biological reasons why that may be. A somewhat older paper, 2003, but estimating that 100,000 heart attacks a year or nearly 200,000 strokes a year directly due to influenza in the USA. And some data suggesting that as many as 1 in 4 heart attacks or strokes may actually be precipitated by a respiratory infection. Typically a more severe respiratory infection, so influenza or pneumonia, but also milder respiratory infection. And so well, you have to stop and pause for a minute, and when you think that, okay, the number 1 causes of and 2 causes of death in the world are myocardial infarction and stroke. However, if a quarter of those have been due to respiratory tract infections, you really have to reassess how significant these viral infections and pneumonias that we just tend to shrug off are in terms of driving mortality, morbidity, and economic cost. There is a lot of this kind of data. And what you're looking at here is that during influenza season, certainly in people over the age of 60, there is a much higher risk, so 1.1 versus 1.39 here, much higher risk of having myocardial infarction during influenza season than not. And more importantly, those who are vaccinated have significantly less myocardial infarctions than patients with the same cardiovascular risk. So getting vaccinated for influenza is not just about preventing you from getting influenza or getting pneumonia from influenza. It actually will also reduce your risk of having a myocardial infarction or stroke. And there's a lot of data like this. So this is a classic study from Finland, where they studied a whole community for 12 years. And what you see is that in people who've had pneumonia, that over time, compared to those who haven't, there is a significant increase of death that increases over time. And most of that increased risk of death is due to cardiovascular mortality. This is some of my earlier work showing that even in people who have no comorbidities, so if you're completely well and you're 45 years of age and you get pneumonia, this is highly relevant to me because I've just had 2 weeks off with right lower lobe pneumonia from metapneumovirus. At 45 years of age, you have a 14% chance of being dead within 2 years. That compares horribly to what if otherwise, the risk should actually be under 1%. And that risk is even higher as you get older. Obviously, if you have comorbidities, if you have diabetes, if you have liver disease, your prognosis is even worse. But the fact that even in people who don't have comorbidities, once you get over 40, that getting something like pneumonia is really quite adverse long-term health events for you is highly significant. And then not surprisingly, if again we go and look at the effect of vaccination and how, why should people get vaccinated? If we look at, for example, the effect of smoking cessation on reducing your risk of heart attack, if you've already got heart disease, you get about a 30 to 40% reduction. If you go and take a statin, 19 to 30%. If you manage your blood pressure, 70 to 25, you get an influenza vaccine, 15 to 45% reduction. Getting influenza vaccine is a major way to prevent you from having myocardial disease. Now, I think what's really fascinating here is that we've had a lot of media and a lot of social commentary on, oh, don't get AstraZeneca because, you know, it's only 88% effective versus Pfizer, which is 92%, and lots of arguments around, you know, 4 or 5% when these COVID vaccine efficacies are in the 80s and above. At best, influenza vaccine is about 45% efficacious in reducing hospitalizations. It's an okay vaccine. It's not a great vaccine. So when COVID dies down, given all that I've just shown you about how impactful getting influenza, getting pneumonia is on not just dying of those diseases, but how much secondary disease it causes, we really have to have a very strong debate about, actually, we're not happy with how efficacious our influenza vaccines are, and we'd actually like better ones, thanks very much. Now, what we've got is clearly helping. I mean, that's almost as powerful as stopping smoking, but we could do an awful lot better if our vaccines were even more effective. I think that's got to be something we all soberly contemplate, is if everyone's making so much fuss about 3 or 4% on COVID vaccines, why have we been comfortable with influenza vaccines that are 45 to 50% at most effective? And this is data from Perth from last year. And this tells us that how powerful all the interventions we've had in trying to stop COVID have been in reducing all other respiratory illnesses. Now, worldwide, it's been reported, there's been a dramatic drop in influenza. Influenza almost disappeared because people were washing their hands, people were practicing cough hygiene. If you were sick, you were not allowed to go to work. Children who were sick either weren't at school in the first place or weren't allowed to go to school. And highly relevantly, airlines were not flying. And for those of you who fly a lot or used to fly a lot like me, the fact that airlines would let people onto the plane coughing and sneezing and bringing who knows what allowed very rapid transit of viruses around the world. And so we would constantly reintroduce any or all variation, new variants of whatever viruses into our community. During 2020, Perth, which, as you all know, we've locked ourselves behind iron walls, and where, you know, our premier's even considering how we can relocate us to another galaxy. We have had zero community spread of COVID, but during 2020, we had absolutely no winter season. This is normal seasons. This is the average. This was, so the dots here are the average of 2016 to 2018. We did have a reasonable flu season during 2019, but we had rates even lower than normal summer. And we're just doing all the analysis of that, but I can tell you also that it wasn't just pneumonia and influenza that dropped away. We've also seen a 20 to 25% reduction in stroke and heart attack. And there are also reductions in things like fractured neck of femur, fractured radius, because what happens when an elderly person gets a bad virus, they get a bit confused, they get a bit weak, they fall. And so it's going to be absolutely fascinating teasing out what the true economic cost of all the viruses that we've accepted coming into our community are, and what position do we want to take moving forward, given that even some relatively simple things like, if you're coughing, you can't come to work, would have, and certainly airlines not allowing anybody on board who has active respiratory symptoms, how powerful might that be in reducing our heart attack rate, our stroke rate, the number of hospital beds we need? This is huge in terms of its impact. To kind of round out, I just want to point out that, so this is a Pubmed search that I did today. And Pubmed, for the general audience, Pubmed is our search engine of all reputable medical literature, is indexed on Pubmed. If you search COVID-19, you will currently get 191,204 articles. If you search pneumonia between 1990 and 2019, there are 159,000 articles. If you search influenza for the same time period, there are 97,000 publications. So it's great that we've had so much effort thrown into COVID, but I hope what I've convinced you is that the ongoing endemic cost of pneumonia and influenza and respiratory viruses is so large that we need much greater effort. And it's shameful that in 20 years, we produced less papers than we've produced in 18 months on COVID. And the potential health impact, if I just slide back to this slide, the potential health impact here of doing better in this space is absolutely enormous. The other thing that I hope I've convinced you of is COVID good? No. But when you put it into context of what has happened around the world, how impactful infection has been in shaping history, and almost certainly shaping our genetics, we got relatively lucky with COVID in that it only has an overall mortality rate of probably 0.3 or 0.4%. We could have had a mortality rate of 5% or 10% or 15%, and that would have been civilization destroying. And we need to be much, much better prepared than we are. And my fear is that, most of the things that we have put in place for COVID-19, if you go back to the literature and look at the forensic dissections of how we didn't keep H1N1 out of the swine flu, out of the community in 2009, and how we responded to that, we're still relearning those lessons again. And my fear is that when COVID disappears, it'll all go back to let's forget about it until the next one. And we may not be lucky the next time. We may get a Plague of Ciprian or a Cocolicci, and then we would be facing very, very different circumstances. So we need better antivirals. We need better vaccines for influenza. We need to understand better how to stop people from getting these secondary complications like heart attacks and strokes when they do get infections. And we need the community to say, actually, you know what, it isn't okay if you're unwell and you're coming to work or you're going to school. And so I hope all of what I've presented helps cement some of that for you. And so I hope that you agree with me that infections have had a massive impact on human evolution, that pandemics and epidemics have really been major turning points in world history. Would we have got where we are without them? Possibly, but I suspect many things would look very different. What I tell every single researcher who wants to work with me or is considering what to do, we're going to solve cancer in my lifetime, I'm sure, unless I get hit by a bus today. We will solve heart disease, but infections will continue to mutate. They breed much faster than we do. They will continue to keep throwing up threats. And when you look at what nasty infections have done to the world, this is as large a threat as global warming. And in fact, hopefully, as I've shown you, in fact, they go together, because a lot of these major events that have changed the world infection-wise have also been associated with major climatic change. And look, infections drive up heart attacks, strokes, many other ills. So please get yourself vaccinated. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. If you'd like to unshare your screen, that'd be great.
Okay.
So we've got a couple of questions, but actually turning it just round positive for a moment, Grant. You mentioned about the development of vaccines and the poor efficacy of the influenza vaccine. I guess one of the things that's been very obvious is the rapid build-up of capacity in developing vaccines, and that's a very positive thing that's happened out of this pandemic.
Absolutely, it is. I think there are many positive things that will come out of this pandemic. So I think our ability to produce vaccines quickly And I think particularly the mRNA technology and how it could be adapted to other viruses is very interesting, and that offers us a lot of hope. I think that our rapid uptake and use of rapid diagnostic technology. So, 2 years ago, most hospitals around the world, if you came in with an infection, you might get an influenza swab, but mostly we would just treat you empirically. Now, most hospitals in the Western world have introduced rapid diagnostics. So we know if someone's got influenza or metapneumovirus or COVID or some bacteria, and that's going to help us in terms of antibiotic stewardship and not using antibiotics as much. But I think it's also going to focus our attention on, actually, you know what, there is an awful lot of metapneumovirus pneumonia out there. Why don't we have a vaccine for it? Why don't we have an effective antiviral for it? And being able to tease out, I presented you a lot of data on pneumonia causes heart attack and stroke, but is it every pneumonia? Is it just bacterial pneumonia? How does metapneumovirus pneumonia compare to adenovirus pneumonia? And our ability to be much more accurate in knowing what's wrong with patients is going to be a huge advantage to us out of all the research that's come out. I think the other thing, enormous advantage, is the enormous amount of work that's been thrown into antivirals. Viral infections have been largely ignored, apart from HIV and hepatitis C and B and maybe cytomegalovirus. The vast number of viruses that we face, we have no effective treatment for. For influenza, the antivirals we have are not particularly great. They don't really reduce mortality significantly. And so what I hope is that out of all of what we've had, we will get some more effective antiviral agents. And that should also have significant impact on healthcare and healthcare outcomes.
Thanks. So we've got some questions from the audience. So from Brett Tolley, who's from the Woolcock. And Brett would like to know, messenger RNA vaccines are a game changer, obviously, in the pandemic. Are you hopeful about this vaccine technology for other viral diseases? Yes, I
am, in particular because I think the mechanism of getting your own cells to produce the relevant antigens enables you to very quickly move from different viruses and trial them. I think, influenza vaccine is not a bad vaccine. But if you're talking about efficacies of 45 to 50%, and we're wanting COVID vaccine efficacies of 90% plus, you've got to, they're not in the same basket. And when you look at the impact that influenza has on us, we want 90% plus efficacy vaccines. And so I think that we've got to reframe our conversation and say, okay, well, we want better now. And that's got to be a major focus of research. And I think mRNA vaccines are a really obvious way to start in terms of picking, some influenza surface proteins and seeing if we can get a better response via that mechanism.
Thank you. And we have a question from Helen Riddell from the Woolcock. And I think actually Helen was Anne Woolcock's last PhD student out of interest. So New South Wales has also had almost zero influenza, and Helen's been showing us that data. But there have been outbreaks of RSV and other viruses, rhinovirus, etc. Helen would like to hear your comments on differential effects of the public hygiene measures on these viruses.
Yeah, that's a great question, Helen. Thank you. So worldwide, RSV broke out of season, and some really recent publications really documenting that really well in France, but also in the US. And rather than being a winter disease, it became a summer disease, and I suspect you saw the same as we did. I think what that tells us is that RSV, the reservoir is within our communities, and there was obviously a build-up of enough of a population of vulnerable younger people that it then started to spread again. And at least, I'm not sure in this situation in New South Wales, but at least in France and the US, the RSV outbreak was very much correlated with kids being allowed back to school. And so I think what you've probably had is kids who have not been exposed, that baseline level of immunity not being there. And then all of a sudden, you've got a huge vulnerable population starting to get together and spread their germs, and away it went. Equally, with metapneumovirus, Australia-wide, we've seen that. It's also been reported in the UK and the US. Again, I think that tells us that metapneumovirus is more of and rhinovirus, to that matter, are more of a resident population with its own reservoir. Whereas the fact that influenza has disappeared, two things. One is, I think the international cycle of influenza is important. It's always been predictable that New Zealand gets it first, and then the Eastern Seaboard, and then the Western Seaboard. And there are very similar trends. So I think international travel is important. But I think you're right. There is something to tease out around how effective basic public health measures are in stopping these. And we've got a chance to critically look at that and try and figure out the hows and whys. But I don't have answers for that. I do think if you look at the modelling for influenza, the potential numbers next winter for us are very scary. And the public health measures that are going to be needed to make sure that we're not facing as bad a situation with influenza as you've seen with COVID do need to be kept at the forefront of our minds.
And especially if we've got a vaccine that's only 50% effective, I guess.
Well, look, I wouldn't want the message out there being don't get vaccinated, okay? Because 50% is better than nothing. But if you look at, Alan Cheng, for example, from the FluCan Network in Melbourne, he's done an amazing job publishing that. And there are many people, I think even maybe Matthew Peters might have been on some of the papers. But the average efficacy is in the 40% for preventing hospitalisation. So, it is an okay vaccine. It's not a great vaccine. And I think when you look at the data for how influenza truly impacts, we want a great vaccine. And there's got to be better research to produce a great vaccine, not just an okay vaccine.
Okay, Robert would like to ask a question.
I'm just interested in your comment about what we face next winter, influenza-wise. It does seem to me that the UK is gearing up as though it's going to have not just continued COVID, but something really bad this winter. Is that the same?
Yeah. So the data already coming out of Israel and Spain and even the UK is rapidly increasing influenza numbers. Influenza immunity depends on having circulation in your community of influenza. Vaccine in itself provides relatively short-lived immunity. And so the not having had significant transmission of influenza in our community is a major problem. Equally, of course, there's also a larger number of at-risk people because on average, 3,000 or 4,000 Australians a year will die of influenza. Those people, if they haven't died of COVID, are still there and going to be more vulnerable. So there's two papers that have just come out from the University of Pittsburgh looking at modelling of what to expect from influenza. And the numbers look dire. And really the two driving factors will be how effective is the vaccine that we produce. So, if it's possible we might get really lucky and maybe this year's strain will get 60 or 70% efficacy. Although in the past, there have been some vaccines that have only been around 30%. The second is what will be the community uptake. And I do worry that with all the anti-vaccine sentiment and that if we have a low uptake of influenza vaccine in our community next winter, we could really be in strife. And so I think it's up to all of us to reiterate how important it is to get vaccinated for influenza.
So related to Robert's question, there's a question from the audience asking you, could you comment on global pandemic preparedness and perhaps comment on that and at the anti-vaccine movement and how it evolved throughout history?
Okay, those are two big topics. So global preparedness, I think what we saw early on, as we saw in H1N1, is governments being generally reluctant around the world to take strict measures to shut everything down and prevent spread because they were worried about the economic impact. And that had consequences in most of the world. Australia got relatively lucky, but even still, it took us a long time to actually shut down our borders. And I think our response in trying to localise and shut down infection needs to be much faster. And part of that's got to be a positive engagement with China. It has 1/3 of the world's population. It has the most dense population. By odds, it's going to be the country where the most of this is going to emerge. We have to work closely with them to help them to do that. Equally, you know, there will be other spots in the world of dense population and that should be focused on. I think all of us worldwide, there has not been enough hospital beds and not enough ICU beds. And there isn't a country in the world, I think, that has not had a problem with inadequate surge capacity. All of our hospitals systems have pretty much been pruned down and pruned down and pruned down so we can just cope at best with peak load during the winter. You add any additional burden to that and we fall over. And we have to have a discussion around how much cost are we prepared to wear in order to have surge capacity when things go wrong. And that's got to be part of pandemic preparedness. I think the other thing that was really disappointing, and I guess I wrote a couple of editorials on this, the medical workforce around the world initially completely threw research principles and ethics out the window, stuff that we learned around the scientific method and first do no harm and get consent just disappeared. And, you know, if you look at some of the early publications from China and Italy and France and Spain, patients were getting given, you know, hydroxychloroquine and pulse methylprednisolone and ritonavir and interferon alpha and all at the same time with no consent, just because the doctors wanted to do something. And it wasn't until we really got some of the platform trials started, and I'm going to talk more about that in my lecture on Friday to people around some of the issues of the platform trials, that it wasn't until we really got that movement going that we started to go back to evidence-based medicine and not just throwing everything at people because we think it might be a good idea. So I think there's also something that the medical community now needs to learn from this in terms of when a new threat faces us, how do we go about things in a rational, scientific, ethical manner to get results? And I think there's some significant international politics at play here as well, because if you look at the sheer number of trials that were put up in COVID that have never got off the ground with everyone doing little bits and pieces, there's been an enormous amount of wasted effort as well. So I think there is a lot of things that we can do with respect to preparedness for a pandemic that partly the medical community needs to lead, but also, you know, I think politically there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And there are some basic decisions that need to be made about what is the ongoing cost to resource us for being able to deal with a future threat. Now, how much risk are we prepared to take by not having invested? Anti-vaxxers. So there were anti-vaxxers, there were people complaining, and there were even medical journal articles around the original development of the smallpox vaccine. People arguing that it was crazy and inhumane, etc. It is a very interesting phenomena that if you try and find evidence for anti-vaccine sentiment around the polio vaccine, there's relatively little until the mid-60s when it started to become well known that there were probably as many cases of, just looking at it's coming from Matt. It's relatively, at the time that it became known that there were more cases of polio from the vaccine and than from polio itself, that's when you first started to get discussions around the dangers of vaccine. But really the telling point was the falsified article on mumps vaccine and the supposed lead levels and that got published. And the internet is a great source of anyone who's a conspiracy theorist can go and find a spot and with people that believe them. I think for me, it's first of all, we have to be honest. There is no such thing as a completely safe vaccine. And to pretend so is dishonest. But it's about odds. So, we've recently had an edict that all people have to be vaccinated or you don't have a job. I spend a lot of time talking to people, and it's around, so Pfizer vaccine. Okay, what's your risk of dying from Pfizer vaccine? Probably 1 in 2.5, 1 in 3 million. You are going to be exposed to COVID. What's your risk of dying of COVID? Well, at 50 years of age, it's probably 0.2%. So that's, that's 2,000 in a million. So, you need to just start to be really honest about the numbers. I think we can't convince everybody, but I'm fundamentally of a belief that if you're part of a community, you have community obligations. Stop lights are there for a reason. You don't get to voluntarily go through them because you want to. I think vaccines, we have a duty to do diligence around what is the risk versus the benefit, and just be honest about that. But as a community, it is the only way we're going to ever get back to normal.
Thank you. All right, so I think we've cross-examined you enough, Grant. So there are a couple more questions, but I'll make sure I put them to Grant later, and we'll get the answers for you later. So I'd like to thank Grant for his talk tonight, his fascinating talk, absolutely fascinating. I'm not sure what the positive message to take away is, but I think I've got it. We could be in more trouble next winter.
The positive message is vaccination is good for you. And that there is still an awful lot of things that we can do that may be quite simple.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, board members. And we look forward to talking to Grant over the next couple of days. Thank you, everybody online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.